Air forks are the ghost of motocross. They keep dying and they keep clawing their way back. Long before KTM ever stamped "ready to race" on a tank, Yamaha was running 35mm Kawasaki air forks on a 1976 YZ400 with little air accumulators sticking up where the fork caps should be. They worked, sort of, and then they vanished for multiple years. They came roaring back in the 2000s, got run out of town a second time, and through both funerals, one brand kept the lights on and refused to bury the body: KTM. To understand why that became one of the most argued about calls in dirt bike tech, you have to understand exactly what you give up and what you steal when you swap a steel spring for a sealed pocket of compressed air. A normal fork uses a coil spring to push back against the ground. An air fork seals a chamber of air and lets the air do the pushing. KTM's weapon is the WP AER 48. AER for air, 48 for the 48mm stanchions, and it's a split design. The left leg holds the air spring, the right leg handles all the damping. Pulling the heavy coil springs out of both legs strips around 3 pounds, roughly 1.5 kilos, off the very front of the bike, and that weight disappears from the worst possible place for handling. Less mass out front and up high means the bike falls into a corner quicker, changes direction with less fight, and lets the front wheel chase chop instead of plowing through it. On paper, you've made the bike lighter and faster steering for free. That's the seduction. Now here's the part people tend to forget, and it's the key to why KTM fell hard for air. Before air, KTM's spring fork was a genuine nightmare. The bike ran the WP4CS, the four-chamber system, from roughly 2014 to 2016, and riders describe it as harsh, dead, unsupportive, and just plain bizarre to tune. The clicker logic felt backwards, softened the compression to calm it down, and the fork would ride lower and get harsher instead of plusher. Guys spent thousands ripping the 4CS out for cone valve forks or Ulins just to make their brand new bikes rideable. So when the AER air fork landed in 2016, it didn't feel like a gimmick. It felt like a jailbreak. KTM wasn't chasing a fad. It was sprinting away from a fork it had every reason to hate, and air was the open door. And that door came with a killer feature: instant, infinite spring rates from a single valve. A coil fork locks you into one rate. Too soft and you blow through the stroke and clack off the bottoming. Too stiff and the front deflects off every braking bump like a skipped stone. Want a different rate, you're buying springs and tearing the fork apart on the bench. The AER hands you one Schrader valve on top of the left leg, and that valve is your spring rate. Pump it up for stiffer, bleed it down for softer, dialed in seconds, usually somewhere in the 9 to 11 bar range depending on the model and your weight. One fork covers a 150-pound vet and a 210-pound pro with nothing more than a few pumps. A dealer stocks one fork instead of a wall of spring rates, and you can respring the front of your bike at the truck between motos when the track turns from soft loam to blue groove hardpack. No coil fork on earth lets you change spring rate in 90 seconds with a hand pump. Air throws in one more gift, and it's pure physics. A rising rate, free of charge. Squeeze a coil and the force climbs in a dead straight line. It's linear, the same push per inch the whole way down. Squeeze a column of air and the pressure spikes harder the deeper you go, so the fork stays supple and plush off the top, then ramps up like a wall near the bottom of the stroke. That's bottoming resistance baked right into the spring with no extra parts, where a coil fork needs progressive wound springs or a hydraulic bottoming cone to fake the same curve. This is exactly why the fastest guys actually liked air for the big hits. Supercross pros loved the way the triple-chamber tack forks refused to bottom on monster landings. The running joke being that if a factory rider can't bottom them, you sure can't either. So if air is lighter, infinitely tunable, and naturally progressive, why did air fork become a slur you mutter in the pits? One word: heat. Trapped air obeys Gay-Lussac's law. Hold the volume constant and crank up the temperature, and the pressure climbs right along with it. Now go rip off a 20-minute moto. The oil churns, the whole assembly bakes, the air pressure rises, and your perfectly set spring rate quietly stiffens itself without asking permission. The fork that felt money on lap 2 can ride higher and harsher on lap 14, which is precisely when your forearms are pumped, your vision's bouncing, and you need the front end calm and planted the most. This bit the triple-chamber Japanese forks worst of all. WP's bypass passages and single-chamber design tame it far better, to the point where many AER owners say the drift is mostly a warm-up the fork settles into. But you still can't argue physics all the way out of the room. Air gets stiffer as it gets hotter, and that's the opposite of what a gassed rider wants late in a moto. The second knock is stiction, the quiet killer. To hold pressure, an air fork needs more aggressive seals, and every bit of extra seal is extra friction dragging on the stanchion as it strokes. Friction is the sworn enemy of small bump sensitivity, because the fork can't break free and start moving until the hit is big enough to overcome that drag. The result is a front end that feels slightly dead and vague off the top. It skates over the little stuff instead of soaking it, and then punches a sharp mid-stroke harshness up through the bars that tuners spend real money trying to revalve away. A good low-friction coil cartridge gliding on oil simply doesn't have to fight itself like that, and on hardpack and braking chop, that buttery initial movement is the precise feel a racer is hunting for. Lose it, and the bike never quite tells you what the front tire is doing. Then comes the maintenance tax, and this is where air forks lose the weekend warrior. Air bleeds down over time, so you check pressure before every single ride with a quality pump, or your whole setup is a guess. You also crack the bleeders on the fork lowers to release the pressure that builds as oil churns down there, because that trapped pocket jacks the fork up and stacks on harshness as the day wears on. And underneath all of it sits a reliability gap a coil simply doesn't have. A steel spring never loses its rate. Shelve the bike for 6 months and it pushes back exactly as it did the day you parked it. An air fork leans on its seals to hold that spring, so when the air side wears or fails, the fork has to come apart and get serviced before it feels right again. To be fair, WP buries the air spring in its own sealed cartridge, so a routine blown fork oil seal won't dump your spring the way the pit doomsayers claim, but you're still trusting pressurized seals to do a job a coil handles with nothing but a hunk of steel that can't go flat. The Japanese lived this entire horror movie first, and they bailed. Honda and Kawasaki jumped early onto Kayaba's SFF-Air fork, then Showa's SFF-Air TAC showed up on the Kawasaki and Suzuki 450s, running 3 separate air chambers, inner, outer, and balance, each chasing a different slice of the spring curve. It was a tuner's hall of mirrors, multiple valves to set, a sweet spot that drifted the instant the fork warmed up, and a contraption the average rider had no prayer of keeping happy. Consumers revolted, an entire cottage industry of air-to-spring conversion kits sprang up to undo the factory's homework, and one by one the brands quietly walked it back to coil. The lone holdout that never took the bait was Yamaha, which rode the trusty Kayaba SSS coil fork straight through the whole craze and got praised for it every single year, becoming the exact benchmark everyone else was scrambling to convert back toward. Air forks earned their ugly reputation on those bikes, fairly and completely. Which brings us to the real question, with the bodies piling up, why did KTM refuse to follow Japan out the door? Because KTM's air fork was not built like the ones that died. The AER runs a single air chamber, not 3, 1 valve, 1 variable, 1 thing to set and forget. The triple-chamber TAC and the multi-valve PSF forks failed precisely because they asked the rider to balance several air springs against each other. WP just swapped the coil for 1 pocket of air and let a self-adjusting balance handle the rest. When it comes to Schrader valves on a fork, 3 is a circus, 2 is still too many, and 1 is just right. And that single valve simplicity is the whole reason KTM's air fork survived the bloodbath that wiped out everyone else's. Stack on the brand math. Ready to Race doesn't backpedal to coil after building its identity around lightweight, infinitely tunable air, plus the one fork stocks the whole range economics, and a fork that genuinely worked well enough to earn real defenders, and KTM had every reason to dig in and ride it out. But here's the thing the diehards don't love to admit. KTM is already retreating, quietly, exactly where it counts most. Their own development riders kept going faster on a spring fork. Cleaner high-speed braking, sharper line tracking, and none of the dead spot the air fork showed on brake release in slow hairpins, where the front would go vague the second you trailed off the lever. So the swap started. The 2024 XC and XCF cross-country bikes got a new WP AER closed-cartridge coil fork. The 2025 SMR Supermoto followed, and the 2026 factory editions, the Halo bikes, the ones built to win, now ship with the closed-cartridge WP AER Pro spring fork as their headline upgrade. Read that art closely and the irony is delicious. KTM fled a hated spring fork into the arms of air a decade ago, and now it's walking right back to a spring fork. Just a vastly better one than the 4CS it ran from in the first place. The circle closed. The loudest verdict, though, comes from the people spending their own money. There's a thriving aftermarket whose entire reason to exist is converting these air forks back to coil, and riders buy those kits by the crate to delete a feature their bike rolled off the showroom floor with. When customers pay good money to undo what the factory bolted on, the argument is settled. The market already cast its ballot. The standard production SX and SXF line is now the last holdout, still rolling on air, surrounded on every side by spring forks on the race bikes, the supermoto, and the off-road models. The ghost of motocross is getting exorcised one more time, and the only thing left to settle is whether this is finally air's permanent funeral or just another long nap before it claws its way back to the surface, the way it always has.